My name is Cassie Baker, and I'm here to present my discourse analysis project on how deaf people communicate private information and hold side conversations with interpreters. The purpose of this project is to see the difference in communication between deaf and hearing culture when it comes to sharing private information. We all know that hearing people whisper or put their hands over their mouths to show that they're telling a secret or sharing something that they don't want shared with the entire room, but we're not sure how, as interpreters, we can recognize when deaf consumers are wanting to have something to us said that is not supposed to be voiced for the entire room or the hearing consumer. So that is our goal in this project. The research I'm going to use for this project is an authentic video analysis of 3 different videos, interpreted situations, interviews with certified working interpreters, and interviews with deaf consumers. For the video observations, I plan on observing the body language of the deaf consumer when talking directly to the interpreter, as well as observing the interpreter's response to this shared information. I'm also going to observe the non-signing consumer for any sign that they are aware of the private interaction going on in the room. Other observations I'm going to take are how working interpreters understand that the information is meant for them and not meant for them to voice to the hearing consumer or the room if they're in that type of a setting. I'm also going to observe on how deaf consumers feel like they make this intention clear to us based on their end of the situation, and then just in general how deaf people share this type of private information with each other. For this portion of the project, the video analysis, I reviewed 3 different videos, and for the reference, they're the 3 videos that we had in class. Video number 1 was the deaf student, the Cynthia Roy video, the deaf student that was a male interpreter, and the woman professor. Video number 2 was the male deaf student, the female interpreter, and the male college advisor. And video number 3 was the female deaf student, the female interpreter, and the male college advisor. Those links are in an email that were sent to us, and I also have provided a copy on Blackboard. The analysis results from video 1. This video did have an occurrence of a side conversation or private interaction between the interpreter and the deaf consumer. I noted the conversational devices used by the deaf consumer during this interaction. He used a hand signal to get the interpreter's attention. He pointed at the interpreter. His body shifted slightly away from the hearing consumer in the room. She was on the phone. And his eye gaze was on the interpreter opposed to the hearing consumer. And then there was a slight topic shift in the conversation. It was an unrelated conversation as to why they were meeting. The interpreter reacted to this type of interaction by asking the deaf consumer if he wanted the question that he had asked voiced to the video recording crew in the background. The hearing consumer was on the phone, and she did not seem to notice that this side conversation went on, and she was not a participant in it at all. After my analysis, I decided that this interaction seemed to be successful. It didn't cause an interruption in the interpretation itself. The conversation wasn't necessarily meant for the hearing consumer, and the hearing consumer was not even aware that it occurred. And the interpreter did not voice it, and since that wasn't the intention, that seemed successful as well. For video number 2, this video did not have an occurrence of a side conversation or private interaction between the interpreter and the deaf consumer. I determined this by noting the conversational devices used by the consumer as well as understanding the interpretation of the message itself. There was no topic shift during this video, and the deaf consumer's eye gaze while signing was on the recipient of the message, which was the college advisor, not the interpreter. There was also no interruption of the interpretation or topic change for clarification in that video. Ways the interpreter reacted to this interaction. Everything signed was voiced in that interpretation. There were no side conversations present, and there was nothing going on other than the conversation between the deaf consumer and the hearing consumer. The hearing consumer stayed focused on the conversation. He didn't notice any side conversations going on because there weren't any, and he seemed to be focused on the deaf consumer. This interaction did seem to be successful. There was no misunderstandings about who the deaf consumer was talking to or anything of that nature. For video number 3, this video did have an occurrence of a side conversation or private interaction at about 1 minute and 24 seconds into the video. This was determined, again, with the conversational devices used by the deaf consumer and just from understanding the interpretation itself. In this video, the woman also used hand signal to get the interpreter's attention. If you look carefully, she actually, while she's signing for her eye gaze, she was signing to the hearing consumer, but as she looked at the interpreter to see how she was interpreting it, she lip read what she had said and realized that it wasn't what she had meant. So she turned back to the interpreter and gave her the hand signal and expressed to her that she did not mean comp out of classes, she meant any comprehensive test for the classes. The deaf consumer expressed that the interpretation was incorrect by signing no, so there was no, it was very clear that this was a side conversation between her, a side communication between her and the interpreter. The ways the interpreter reacted to this interaction, the interpreter voiced, "Oh, I'm sorry." She didn't make it 100% clear that it was an interpreter error, but I think it was mostly clear regardless in the message. Her intonation and pitch changed once the clarification was understood, and if you listen at the very end when she says this class, she says it very quietly. The response of the hearing consumer stayed focused on the conversation despite the interruption. The interruption was very obvious, so there's no way the hearing consumer did not realize it was going on, but he still stayed focused on the conversation and did not make any comments regarding that interaction. Based on my analysis, this interaction was not successful. The hearing consumer was aware that the deaf consumer's interaction with the interpreter was happening, although he was probably not aware of where the actual breakdown occurred because the conversation was not completely voiced. So the cumulative results for both of these videos, with private interaction, it looks like eye gaze is probably the main indicator when a private interaction is taking place. Typically, whenever the deaf consumer is signing, they will be looking at their hearing recipient of the message. They'll only be looking at the interpreter when the interpreter is actually the one signing. However, when there's a private interaction, the deaf consumer does make eye contact with the interpreter opposed to the hearing message recipient. Hand signals were also used in both videos for the deaf consumer to address the interpreter directly, so that made it very clear to the interpreter that this was something being said to them opposed to being said to the other person in the interaction. In the video without private interaction, eye gaze was more focused on the hearing consumer when the deaf consumer was signing, which goes back to the opposite of what happened in the private interaction. There was no break in the conversation at all when the side conversation was occurring, and no hand signals were used to address either the hearing consumer or the interpreter in those interactions. So the interview results, I interviewed 3 of my deaf friends and 2 of my interpreter friends. I basically asked them 3 questions. I asked them how they let an interpreter know that they're asking them something, whether it be for clarification or a side conversation, anything like that. I also asked them how they how they communicate with each other, private information when they're all in the same room. And then I asked them how they feel the interpreter reacts whenever they direct the information directly at them. All 3 of the deaf consumers I interviewed agreed that they typically let the interpreter know by either waving at them or pointing at them. They also confirmed that they look at the interpreter while they're signing in that particular situation. Because the deaf consumers really don't analyze their own communication, they really didn't notate anything like body shifting or anything like that. So really, these were the only 2 things that they knew for sure themselves without analyzing their own communications. With the interpreters, initially both interpreters said they just knew when it was directed at them, which is similar to what Annie Mark said in our class the other day when we were discussing that. But once I got them to think more about it, one interpreter noted the waving pointing, and then the other noted a body shift by the deaf consumer. She said it was a very slight body shift, but that she could tell that the deaf consumer was no longer focused on the hearing speaker, but focused on herself. So the conclusion of this analysis is that several factors affect how interpreters are aware of private and side conversations are happening. Body language is one of them. Eye gaze, hand signals, their gut instinct, and a need for clarification. Both of the interpreters had said that if they knew it was something such as a long name that had a confusing spelling, or something very technical or specific to the topic of the conversation, that they were kind of prepared for the deaf consumer to ask for clarification. So they were a little more ready for that private interaction with the deaf consumer. As far as my resources go, all 3 of the videos were the videos that were given to us in class, so I cannot cite these since this is going to be on YouTube due to the confidentiality statement Lynn sent in the email. All of my deaf and interpreter interviewees did not want their names posted on the YouTube site, but I can get those names if they are necessary. Thank you, and I hope you enjoyed and benefited from my analysis.